August 10, 1628. A brand new warship, literally the largest and most heavily armed vessel the Baltic Sea has ever seen, slips away from its moorings in Stockholm. Exactly 20 minutes later, this towering fortress of oak and bronze is completely submerged at the bottom of the harbor, barely a kilometer from where it started. It's a bright, practically windless Sunday afternoon. Thousands of cheering citizens, dignitaries, and foreign diplomats are lining the waterfront, all there to witness the maiden voyage of the Swedish Empire's crowning jewel, the Vasa. This ship was supposed to project unrivaled imperial power. Instead, that massive crowd just stood there in sheer horror, watching it go down almost instantly. I mean, think about that contrast. You have decades of intense imperial ambition, totally annihilated in 20 minutes. So how does something like that even happen? Well, the answer really comes down to the number 64. That is the massive number of bronze cannons King Gustavus Adolphus ordered onto this single vessel. Now, the king was a brilliant military commander, right? But he was currently fighting in Poland, deeply entangled in the religious wars of Europe, and he was, well, impatient. He was leading a nation on the rise and demanded absolutely unprecedented firepower. He wanted heavy 24-pounder artillery crammed right at the very top of the hull to completely dominate those cold northern waters. To pull this off, the Swedish Navy hired a Dutch master shipwright named Henrik Hybertsson. Here's the thing about 17th century shipbuilding. They didn't use mathematical engineering. It was basically all built on tradition, intuition, and rules of thumb. But there was zero tradition for what the king was demanding here. The Vasa was originally planned to have just a single gun deck. Simple enough. But mid-build, the king demands a massive redesign. He wants 2 full decks, plus those 64 heavy cannons we talked about, and, just to top it off, hundreds of massive, elaborately carved wind sculptures. We're talking lions, biblical figures, mythological creatures, the whole shebang. It turned into a completely fatal physics equation. You've got way too much weight, way too high up, and way too little ballast, too low down. All that beautiful, heavy ornamentation, the extra deck, and those massive bronze cannons created a vessel that was just incredibly top-heavy. The bottom of the hull simply didn't have enough ballast to counterbalance this towering mass of guns and decorations looming way above the waterline. Now, here is a detail that is honestly pretty shocking. The builders absolutely knew she was doomed before she ever untied her ropes. They actually ran a stability test while the ship was still tied to the quay. The supervising officers ordered exactly 30 sailors to just run back and forth from one side of the deck to the other in unison to see how the vessel would rock. The result was sheer terror. The supervising officer literally had to shout, "Stop the test or she will capsize at the dock." After just 3 crossings by those 30 men, the Vasa heeled so violently they had to abort the whole thing immediately. Just let that sink in for a second. A light jog by 30 guys almost flipped a multi-ton warship right there at the dock. It was a glaring, screaming warning that this ship was fundamentally unstable. Yet, nothing happened. Absolute silence followed. It's like a bizarre standoff. On one hand, you have a fatally flawed ship, proven beyond a doubt by the physical test. On the other, a powerful, incredibly impatient king demanding his worship. To make matters worse, Master Shipwright Hybertsson had actually fallen ill and died a year before completion. So the surviving hierarchy of officials and builders, they were totally trapped. Because admitting the ship couldn't float meant walking up to a warring, demanding king and telling him his incredibly expensive centerpiece was a complete dud. So they swallowed their terror, ignored the test results, and just prepped the ship for the maiden voyage. And that maiden voyage was terrifyingly fast. Minute 0, sails are set from the Stockholm waterfront. Minute 5, she's traveled barely a kilometer. Minute 10, a gust of wind catches the sails. And the records actually note this was a mild breeze, not a storm, just a breeze. But the top-heavy hull heels sharply, tilting super dangerously to one side. She barely rights herself. Then, at minute 15, a second mild gust strikes. This time, the Vasa leans so far over that the cold sea violently floods into the open lower gun ports. Once that water entered the hull, physics completely took over. By minute 20, she rolled right onto her side and settled directly into the harbor mud, dragging roughly 30 trapped souls down with her, right in front of that horrified crowd. The immediate aftermath was, as you'd guess, sheer national humiliation and a panicked inquiry. The surviving officers and builders desperately needed a scapegoat, but they all shared the exact same bulletproof defense. They followed the king's exact proportions and specifications. and that led to a very uncomfortable truth. To blame the ship's design meant directly indicting King Gustavus Adolphus himself. So the final verdict? Absolutely no one was punished. The enquiry wrapped up, and the whole catastrophe was immediately absorbed into this massive, awkward silence spanning 333 years. The failure of the powerful was just quietly swallowed by history. The great golden pride of the Swedish Navy was basically abandoned, left rotting in the cold, brackish mud of Stockholm harbor for over 3 centuries. But right here, the story takes a totally unexpected twist. Enter the shipworm, or Teredo navalis. It's this marine bivalve mollusk that rapidly devours submerged wooden structures in warm, salty oceans. These little guys destroy sunken galleons all over the world. But the Baltic Sea? It's incredibly unique. Its waters are far too cold and way too low in salt for the shipworm to even survive. Which brings us to this profound, almost beautiful irony. What killed her is exactly what saved her. Because the Vasa was incredibly top-heavy, and because she sank instantly in that exact freezing harbor, her oak hull was immediately buried in protective mud, totally out of reach of shipworms. After 333 years down there in 1961, the ship was carefully raised from the harbor floor in this extraordinary feat of marine salvage, and she emerged into the daylight with thousands of her intricately carved wooden sculptures astonishingly, completely intact. Today, she sits in a purpose-built museum in Stockholm, a 17th century fortress perfectly preserved forever. It is literally the only largely intact 17th century ship anywhere in the world. She exists today as this flawless masterpiece, frozen in time, solely because she was entirely too flawed to float. It really leaves us with a haunting question, doesn't it? How many other magnificent failures are waiting in the dark simply because no one dared to tell a king no?